The Force ability known as Resigning was a weapon inherently associated with the dark side, as users could summon violent bursts of electrical current on their opponents. With effects ranging from damage to the skin to paralysing a skeleton and immobilising the heart, it is no surprise that the Jedi classified this ability as a forbidden technique. Nevertheless, some Jedi used variations such as Emerald Lightning or Electric Judgment, which required a user to display control and a level-headed assessment of the moment, as well as a natural ability. But what if Anakin Skywalker had the ability of Resigning? How would this be seen by the Jedi? Would this encourage an earlier turn to the dark side? The story begins with the 12-year-old Anakin Skywalker, who under his master Obi-Wan Kenobi was growing into a powerful but overconfident Padawan. On this particular day, Anakin was the most excited Jedi in the temple because Obi-Wan had told him that they were leaving for a special mission. Entering the front of the Jedi T6 shuttle with his master, Anakin took notice of his surroundings and all of the controls of the ship as they departed for the unknown regions. Anakin was buzzing with excitement by the time they reached their destination, which Obi-Wan revealed was the planet of Ilum, and Anakin could obtain his lightsaber crystal. Allowing Anakin to land the shuttle, the two Jedi now wore clothing that suited the bitterly cold environment, and when the ramp of the shuttle lowered, they were greeted by a violent snowstorm. The additional burst of cold air did not dampen Anakin's excitement, and after an extended period of walking, Obi-Wan suddenly stops as they face a large jagged cliff face. What appears to be an impenetrable wall of ice was not quite as it seemed, and Obi-Wan asked his Padawan to defy the winds and focus on what was behind the wall. Though we had initially thought that the wall was slightly intimidating, it was actually an intricate puzzle serving as a guardian for the crystals within, and drawing upon the Force, he manipulated the sliding rocks to unveil an entrance. Once Obi-Wan guided Anakin inside the heart of the mountain, they were now in a room with a towering ceiling. With ornate statues carved from the ice, they saw multiple entrances, most of which extended to the inside of the Jedi Temple. The Jedi Master calmly opened a previously hidden window in one of the upper levels, and the sun shone through the gap to melt the entrance to the Crystal Cave. Pointing to the entrance, he told Anakin that what lay within the cave would be his true test, and his Padawan walked through the door alone. The first few steps were cautious, as he carefully scanned the shadows, either side of the stone pillars for any obstacles, before he reached a crossroad. Anakin could feel the Force guiding him to the left of these paths, and soon the walls of his path echoed with voices. The confident Anakin pushed forwards, continuing to scan his surroundings for his crystal, until he saw a silhouette of Shmi. The Jedi stopped in his tracks, as the figure of Maul suddenly thrust his lightsaber through her, and Anakin screamed in pain and anger before attempting to push Maul back into the wall of the narrow path. The blurred visage of Maul rebounded, and now used his double-bladed lightsaber to stab Qui-Gon, Padme, then Obi-Wan. Anakin's howls almost reached Obi-Wan on the outside of the cave, and fearing he would lose someone else he cared about, he felt an energy coursing through his body as he summoned his first ever lightning attack. As the visage of Maul receded into the air, Anakin could still feel the crackling at his fingertips, and stared at them in shock and amazement, before turning to the next part of his path. As daylight turned towards sunset, Anakin scaled the cliff face in front of him, and retrieving his Adegan crystal, he ran back outside before the mouth of the caves closed. Anakin had to check that Obi-Wan was actually real, and not another illusion for Maul to slay, before they returned to the ship in much calmer weather. Aboard the ship, Obi-Wan assumed the role of pilot for the return to Coruscant, whilst Anakin meditated for several days to try and channel the Force through his crystal. The Padawan was not a Jedi who let go of his memories, and unable to forget how Maul had tested his mind, some of his dark side emotions were poured into his crystal. Unknown to the focused Anakin, Obi-Wan was watching his meditation with concern and awe, and the crystal started to fracture and glow. Anakin's fingertips were flowing with electrical current, and as the components of the lightsaber merged together, he caught the lightsaber in his hand and ignited it to reveal an odd shade of blue before the crystal's housing began to shake. Anakin quickly deactivated the weapon before it erupted, and at Obi-Wan's suggestion, he bored 2 holes into the side of the power regulation chamber, and when he ignited the lightsaber again, he now had a crossguard lightsaber. With the ship now approaching Coruscant, Obi-Wan returned to the helm, and his mind was full of questions. Obi-Wan knew that the experiences in the cave had shaken Anakin and that had affected the construction of his lightsaber, but some of his substantial powers would raise questions amongst the council. When Obi-Wan calmly landed the T6 shuttle in the temple hangar, he allowed Anakin to run to their quarters, whilst he headed for the Jedi Council's chamber. There he waited for their session to conclude, and he intercepted the Keldor Jedi Master Plo Koon, who he thought could help Anakin control his lightning, given his affinity with electric judgment. The affinity that Anakin's ability had with the dark side was a sufficient incentive for the Jedi Master to intervene, and walking to the Padawan's quarters, Anakin was initially afraid that the Jedi Council would arrive to punish him. The Keldor Master calmly told Anakin that he was here to help him control his newfound powers, and after Anakin reported what had happened in the cave, and when he had built his lightsaber, Plo Koon made a note of Anakin's actions. His usually unreadable face was showing concern, as Anakin had not used lightning with a sense of justice, but as a way of exacting revenge on the visage of Maul. With Plo Koon meditating to try and find an adequate solution, Anakin is summoned by the Chancellor to meet him in his office, and the Padawan greets the man who had become his mentor. Taking a seat opposite the Chancellor, he saw the air traffic of the galactic city whizzing past, and the distant plumes of smoke rising from the industrial sector. Turning to face Palpatine, he proudly brandished his new cross-guarded lightsaber and recalled his adventures in the Crystal Caves. Whilst Palpatine showed concern at some of the perils faced by Anakin, he was secretly pleased that Anakin had accessed his inner darkness, and perhaps he would need to accelerate his plans to ensure Anakin would become his future apprentice. Once Anakin left his office, Palpatine dimmed the lighting in his suite and walked through the door on his left, then down the corridor to his private suite. Turning on the holo projector, he summoned the hologram of his apprentice from across the galaxy, and when Dooku bowed to him, they had both sensed a disturbance in the Force. With Dooku working on trying to raise the clone army, they would also need a way to eliminate more skilled Jedi, even with the surprise which would be created by Order 66. The solution had seemed to present itself, with Anakin's sudden display of the dark side, but now Palpatine needed to interfere and use his masterful manipulation tactics to separate Anakin and the Jedi. Calling for his Senate guards to prepare his speeder, the Chancellor is escorted to the Jedi Temple and is met by Master Mace Windu. Requesting to see the progress of Anakin, he is guided to the training room and surrounded by a group of other Padawans. Anakin was battling a training droid. Unlike standard Marksman H-type remote droids, this was a more advanced Jedi training droid and had been heavily modified by Anakin to be a replica of Maul. Unwilling to be beaten again, Anakin's focus was intense, and the Jedi Masters on the balcony above him could sense that he was flickering with the dark side and frowned. When Anakin finally decapitated the head of the droid, he was about to reattach the head and start another duel when he was interrupted by applause from Palpatine. The Chancellor beckoned Anakin to the upper level, and the other Padawans were relieved to finally have a turn with the training droid as Anakin deactivated his lightsaber. Walking through the corridors of the temple, Palpatine asked Anakin if he was truly happy with the Jedi, and the Padawan was taken aback, as this was not a question he had considered. When he had been inducted into the Order, Anakin had initially struggled to adapt, clashing with Obi-Wan and his other teachers, and due to his status as the subject of the Chosen One prophecy, he was ostracized by others. Now that he thought about it, he was no closer to his original goal when joining the Order, which was to return to Tatooine and free Shmi. Palpatine could sense the doubts that were circulating in Anakin's mind, and he deliberately questioned what the Jedi had done to free the slaves, knowing they had done next to nothing. Though this was partially Palpatine's own fault, as the Jedi were now responding to the request of the Senate, he wanted to show Anakin the flaws of the Jedi, and that they were selective about who they should help. As Anakin and Palpatine arrived to a stop, the Padawan could see that Obi-Wan and Windu were trailing behind them and allowed the Chancellor to return to his office. Handing his newly created lightsaber over to his master, Obi-Wan was shocked that Anakin was resigning from the Order, whilst Windu was less surprised, as he had always thought that Anakin was too old to be trained. Taking Anakin away from Master Windu, Obi-Wan asked Anakin why he had arrived to such a decision, and the Jedi outlined the inadequacies of the Order. All of Anakin's criticism stung Obi-Wan, and he felt like it was disappointing Qui-Gon, having promised to train him. When he thought about how he had trained Anakin, he realised that many of their differences would have been solved if Qui-Gon had been Anakin's master instead, but as he had learned from him, he needed to focus on the present. Though he believed he could not do anything about the slaves, without the approval of the Council and the Senate, Obi-Wan believed he knew of one person who could convince Anakin to remain with the Jedi. With permission from the Council, Obi-Wan and Anakin left the sanctuary on Coruscant and headed for the mid-rim world of Naboo. Anakin was buzzing with excitement, knowing that there was a chance they would see Padme Amidala for the first time since the battle on the planet, and Obi-Wan calmly landed in the Theed hangar. Met by a small group of the Royal Security Forces, Obi-Wan stepped out and informed them of their intentions to see Queen Amidala. As it happened, the Regency of Naboo was undergoing a period of transition, and having already served 2 terms, Padme had declined an unprecedented request for a third, handing the reins to Raylata. Once the guards completed their security checks of the Jedi, they are taken to the 5th floor of the palace, and the handmaidens are helping Amidala create a new wardrobe for her role as a senator. Padme and Anakin were shocked to see the other, and as Obi-Wan talked to the handmaidens about Naboo's current political situation, Anakin was rapidly recalling his first years as a Jedi. As he showed her the Japor pendant, which he had retained from one of their previous meetings, inevitably he was reminded of the sadness of missing Shmi. Padme was mortified that the Jedi had stood still, despite Tatooine being outside of the Republic's jurisdiction, and she decided to incorporate the freeing of the slaves in her plans. Obi-Wan's discussion with the handmaidens had also enlightened him, as he could now understand why Jedi such as Dooku had left the Order, and why Qui-Gon had a perspective beyond the walls of the temple. As he thought about the many civilians that he and Qui-Gon had encountered, he realised why he had met these seemingly insignificant people compared to all of the politicians and regents, and perhaps it was time for him to also consider leaving the Order. Leaving Anakin to continue talking to Padme and her handmaidens, Obi-Wan returned to the ship, and after several moments of hesitation, he turned on the holoprojector to talk to Yoda. The Grand Master may have been on Coruscant, but he could still sense Obi-Wan's shift since he had left the temple. Obi-Wan revealed that his trip to Naboo had helped him to understand that there were many people across the galaxy who were suffering because of the Jedi's increasingly tightening ties with the Senate. Offering both his resignation and to return his lightsaber, Yoda allowed the 2 Jedi to keep their weapons, believing that they would use them for the good of the galaxy. When Anakin returned to the ship, he thought that he was bidding farewell to his master, but he was pleased to see that Obi-Wan was preparing it for their next adventure. With both Jedi leaving the Order, Obi-Wan decides to help continue Anakin's training, but slightly alter their approach to suit Anakin more. Without the guidance of a more senior Jedi, Obi-Wan took Anakin to the world of Sereno, which he knew was the residence of former Jedi Master Dooku, in the hope that he could advise the 2 Jedi. When the 2 Jedi arrived at the front of Dooku's castle, Dooku was seemingly waiting for them, and having heard about their departure from the Jedi Order, he had been ordered by Sidious to corrupt them with the dark side. Now inviting the 2 Jedi into his residence, he knew the Jedi were here for his teachings, and as the last connection to Qui-Gon, he would have to tread carefully to sustain their trust. Obi-Wan and Anakin soon began their new life under Dooku, and though Obi-Wan initially struggled to change some of his Jedi habits, he was able to adapt, whilst Anakin was establishing control of his new powers, including his lightning abilities. Largely unaware that they were being led down a dark path, Dooku started to teach and inform of the corruption in the Senate, but gradually incorporated them into his own plans to collect powerful systems who were either displeased by the Republic or were easily manipulated. The discourse created by Dooku's speeches was spread by both Obi-Wan and Anakin, and for the younger of the Jedi, this allowed him to complete his original goal when he left the Jedi, which was to free Shmi. Though Obi-Wan feared that Anakin would be unable to control himself, particularly around Watto and the other slavers, he saw this as a test and allowed Anakin to travel to Tatooine alone. The former Jedi Padawan was apprehensive during his journey to the world in an old Corellian light freighter, but when he arrived in Mos Espa's spaceport, his mind was clear. Taking the series of familiar alleyways and roads to Watto's workshop, he could hear the voice of the Toydarian, and now he saw that the front of the shop was more dilapidated than his previous visit. When Anakin walked under the doorway, he saw many of the tools that he had helped to repair were scattered across the floor, and he felt something was amiss. Rushing to the yard at the back of the workshop, he saw 3 people and quickly assessed the situation. Watto was furiously gambling with a man Anakin didn't know, and Shmi was moving slowly in the far corner, so Anakin shot a lightning attack at Watto, and he was sent spiraling onto the floor. The man introduced himself as Owen Lars, and helping Shmi back to her feet, Anakin claimed he had returned to fulfill his promise, which he had made when he was last on the planet. As it turned out, Shmi had not been sitting still since Anakin's departure, and together with a group of other slaves called the White Suns, she had been trying to create a device to remove their slave trackers. Anakin's return allowed her to gather the White Suns and coerce the slavers into deactivating the slave trackers, causing Mos Espa to descend into chaos. Slaves outside of the White Suns saw this as their moment to break free, and Anakin had to summon reinforcements from Naboo to provide transportation off of the planet. With most of the former slaves working for Naboo's monarchy or Senate Amidala, Anakin returned to Sereno, where only Obi-Wan remained. The Master told his Padawan that Dooku had left to find a suitable clone template for their army, and he also sensed that the Separatist leader wanted them for something more sinister than just politics. Anakin believed that Dooku had given him the pathway to free Shmi, so he didn't mind returning the favour to Dooku, and they began to support anti-Republic uprisings and negotiate weapons deals. Together they helped to establish a droid army for the Confederacy, but Obi-Wan and Anakin's growing powers were now a problem for Darth Sidious. The Sith Lord had not minded Dooku keeping the two Jedi to assist him, but now they were growing too powerful, and Obi-Wan was excess to their requirements. When Dooku had completed his meeting on Geonosis, the apprentice received an ominous transmission from his master to eliminate the growing threat that was Obi-Wan Kenobi. Dooku was hesitant as he bowed to his master to accept the mission, and for the sake of his personal plans to overthrow Sidious, as well as his loyalties to Qui-Gon, he struggled to bring himself to completely eliminate Obi-Wan, luring Obi-Wan out of Sereno and separating Anakin by giving him a mission on Geonosis. Dooku remotely ordered his prototype fleet to open fire. Aboard his T-6 shuttle, Obi-Wan was right to have been suspicious about Dooku, but he was still underprepared to face an entire fleet. Even with his immense reflexes and the unique upright design of the shuttle, the first wave of turret fire cannoned into the hull of the ship, and Obi-Wan was sent tumbling into the planet below. The world happened to be Fucia, as Obi-Wan had been on his way to help the Separatists recruit the Commerce Guild, but now he was arriving at a much greater speed than he had intended. Obi-Wan was not one to panic, and ejecting the survivor capsule from the ship, he rolled out into a ball-shaped pod before arriving to a standstill. Once the capsule sprung open, the former Jedi dusted himself off before the impact of Dooku's betrayal dawned on him. Though he had taken some measures to protect himself, he had not done enough to defend Anakin, who was always more susceptible, and now they were worlds apart. Obi-Wan did have some knowledge of Fucia from stories told by Qui-Gon, and the creatures and brightly coloured planets in the jungle were brought under Obi-Wan's control. They also served as a guide to the nearest civilization, which was a small farmland, and there Obi-Wan heard from the farmers that the previous dormant base of the Commerce Guild had now intensified their operations on the planet. With their farm now being threatened, Obi-Wan decides to help them, and on the edge of the farmland he could see the outline of a Separatist outpost. The scorch marks on the walls indicated recent activity, and Obi-Wan climbed to the top of the walls to see prototype droids being shifted into strategic positions by members of the Commerce Guild. Identifying the location of the transport, Obi-Wan manoeuvred his way around the perimeter of the base, then pulled the stationed Jedivex-class starfighter towards him. The droid sensors were alerted to the movement, but Obi-Wan was sufficiently hidden to avoid detection, even utilising a box of supply crates to hide the ramp. The representatives that Dooku had set him up to meet were now scrambling back to the ship, but Obi-Wan was too fast, and once he was in the cockpit, he used his double laser cannons to open fire on the outpost. Whilst the droids scrambled in all directions, Obi-Wan noticed that his cargo hold was occupied by two crates, and they were labelled as explosive. Raising the ship into the air, he released the crates and force pushed them into the heart of the outpost, and the dangerous Ipsium created a series of chain reactions. Obi-Wan could see the farmers raising their pitchforks into the air, but this brief moment of joy was quickly replaced by concern for Anakin. His Padawan would now be exposed on Geonosis, so lowering the sail on the starfighter, he used the existing list of locations on the navigational computer to find the correct coordinates. News of the destruction that Obi-Wan had caused was now being broadcast over some of the communication channels, but he had ensured his identity remained hidden. Using the rest of the journey across the Outer Rim to meditate on the most recent events, Obi-Wan eventually arrived upon Geonosis, which he knew was one of the largest operating areas for Dooku's Confederacy. He was fortunate that the coordinates on the Navi computer led directly to one of the hangars in the Separatist hideout, and he opted to land beneath it and out of plain sight. Obi-Wan could hear whispers and murmurs as he tiptoed closer to the hideout, and he was met by a shocking sight. Anakin was bowing to the foot of Dooku, but also to the feet of a mysterious hooded figure who called himself Darth Sidious, and even though he was just a hologram, Obi-Wan could sense his power. Knowing Anakin better than almost anyone in the galaxy, Obi-Wan knew that the Sith must have told him that he had died over Fucia, and they capitalized on Anakin's anger. Once the hologram of Sidious left the room, Obi-Wan wasted no time and angrily force-pushed Dooku into the wall, temporarily knocking him out. Jumping down to his Padawan, he saw Anakin's eyes were flickering, and he told him that he would not be killed so easily. Anakin's anger somewhat subsided at the sight of his master, but it was now redirected at Dooku for his lies, and raising his hand at the recovering Sith, he shot blindingly bright lightning at him. Dooku desperately attempted to repel the attack by raising his own hands, and tried to tell Anakin that they had to work together to defeat Sidious, but he was greeted with silence before he slumped to the ground. Anakin looked at his hands when he realised what he had done, and Obi-Wan placed a calming hand on his shoulder to remind him that Dooku had been the one to order his termination above Fucia, and he appreciated his defence. The former Padawan was still conflicted when they were prevented from leaving Geonosis by another transmission on the holoprojector, this time for Nute Gunray, and the Neimoidium told him that a protocol droid had performed its task on Coruscant and had assassinated Senator Amidala and a delegation. Obi-Wan could not blame his Padawan for crushing the holoprojector with the Force, and they spared no time jumping into Obi-Wan's Genevex starfighter, then travelling to Coruscant. Their attempts to access the HoloNet only left them with confusion, with mixed reports about the health of the victims, and they tried to consult Queen Raylata. The Queen was also on her way to Coruscant, and she revealed that Padme had begun a rudimentary senatorial induction course, and she had just attended a gathering with other senators, hosted by Chancellor Palpatine. Obi-Wan and Anakin were the first to arrive in the heart of the Republic, just before security was increased in the planet's skylines, and after landing in the western spaceport, Anakin piloted an airspeeder to the Senate's Med Center. By the time they reached the building, the press and other senators surrounded Padme's ward, but crucially, he could see that she had survived. When Queen Raylata arrived, Anakin and Obi-Wan were able to walk inside the ward, and he breathed another sigh of relief that Shmi was unscathed, having been in a separate room to the protocol droid's detonator. Anakin revealed that he had heard Nute Gunray discussing the attempt with Dooku, but with much of the evidence destroyed by himself, there was little they could do to convict the Neimoidian. The Chancellor also joined the list of visitors, and appearing to be more dishevelled than usual, the former Jedi didn't miss the look of surprise when he saw Obi-Wan. With the health of Padme and those around her confirmed, Anakin and Obi-Wan headed for the scene of the crime, where crime scene droids and Jedi investigators were already at work. Desperately searching for incriminating evidence, the Master and Padawan were alerted to more breaking news, which was that Dooku's body had been found in his hideout on Geonosis. Though Anakin had talked to Darth Sidious, he did not know the identity of the man behind the hood, but the reaction to Dooku's fall would surely bring out the Sith. The fall of the Separatist leader caused turmoil amongst the allies, and holding a secret meeting with Darth Sidious, the Sith Lord appointed San Hill as a de facto leader. Sidious also had a problem with the clone army, which was still incomplete, and having seen Anakin at the Med Center, he wasn't sure of his true loyalties. Once Sidious left the meeting, he wisely chose to return to the Senate chamber, and in front of the senators, who were not in the Med Center, he motioned for the passing of the Military Creation Act to help protect the galaxy from replicating the recent atrocities. Palpatine's efforts to increase his political powers and raise the clone army were helped by the Jedi sending a team to investigate Dooku's demise on Geonosis, and subsequently discovered the droid factory. The knowledge that the Separatists were secretly building their own army was a shock to most of the Republic senators, and despite Padme's protests when she returned, Palpatine was on the verge of getting what he had wanted. Whilst Palpatine had been making moves for his power, Anakin in particular had grown suspicious of the Chancellor, as he had seemed to benefit from the demise of Dooku and the attempt on Senator Amidala's life. Suspicions were not enough though, and with Obi-Wan, they decided to travel to Kamino to evaluate the secret clone army and how the Kaminoans reacted to the absence of Dooku. When the two former Jedi reached the storms of Kamino, they posed as Dooku's associates and met Prime Minister Lama Su and scientist Nala Se. Pretending to be saddened by the loss of Dooku, they learned that Tyrannus had included a control chip in each of the clones, which Nala Se told them was to protect against rogue Jedi. Anakin knew Dooku better, and didn't believe that he had implemented these chips just to satisfy the demands of the late Sifo Dyas, and his hand subtly moved to his lightsaber. But before his anger exploded, Obi-Wan informed that Tyrannus was in fact the late Dooku, and if he had been deceptive about his identity, he could have also been hiding the true motive behind the clones. The Kaminoans believed that they were just carrying out Sifo Dyas's instructions to make a profit for themselves, and had no particular bias to the Jedi, but Obi-Wan convinced that the quality of their work was contrary to Sifo Dyas's wishes. Nala Se leads the Master and Padawan to a private laboratory, and placing one of the control chips on one of the consoles, a large screen begins to display details of the chips. The eyes of the room's occupants widen when they see Order 66 in particular, and transferring this valuable information to a data rod, Anakin threatened the Kaminoans into removing the chips, or risks their research being destroyed. Returning to Coruscant, the Jedi were in a hurry as they continued to hear that Palpatine was attempting to push the military bill through, and Padme was trying to stall for time. When it looked like her resistance was about to fold, Anakin and Obi-Wan finally returned to Coruscant, and after docking in the Jedi Temple hangar, they burst through to the war room, ignoring the chasing Temple guards or the shocked Jedi. The council members had left the comfort of their chamber to see what the commotion was about, and what they did not expect to see was 2 of their lost Jedi and a hologram of a clone trooper. Anakin and Obi-Wan quickly summarized what they learned on Kamino, and why it was imperative that the Military Creation Act must not be passed. Yoda assessed the situation and saw the potential threat that this new army posed to their order, so he allowed the 2 former Jedi to arrest Palpatine, and he would organize a backup team. Just as the Senate were making their votes on whether to provide Palpatine with the power to create his army, Anakin took one of the vacant repulsor pods, then pointed to the Chancellor and branded him a traitor of the Republic. Palpatine outwardly looked shocked at the accusations and ordered for the Senate guards to detain Anakin, but they were stopped by a large holographic image of Palpatine and a list of his orders for the clone army. Most of the senators looked aghast that the Chancellor had a plan to destroy the Jedi Order, but Palpatine calmly stated that this army must have been set up during the reign of Chancellor Valorum. Anakin was lost for words at this unexpected response, but Obi-Wan stepped in and presented evidence that dated the clone army's creation to be at least 5 years after Palpatine had been appointed. Some of Dooku's conversations with the Kaminoans, which were found in his castle, were also used against Palpatine, and the senators were calling for a vote of no confidence. Before the situation escalated, Master Amida called a session to a temporary end, and the Chancellor retreated to his suite. Angered by his plans being squashed, the Sith Lord could not start the war he wanted, but the Republic had yet to shut down all of the droid factories. But before he could organise another meeting with the Separatist Council, the door of the turbo lift opened, and there stood Anakin with his lightsaber ignited. Unlike the timid boy who had once sought his advice, Palpatine saw a cold and confident opponent, and someone who could have made for a worthy apprentice. Though his powers had grown, Palpatine refused to believe they could match his own, and he vowed to show Anakin a real lightning attack. Before Anakin moved forward, currents of Sith lightning enveloped his body, and his eyes flashed as he increased the intensity of the bolts, before he stopped to revel in his inevitable victory. As Palpatine unleashed what he planned to be his last attack, Anakin drew himself from the floor and screamed in a howl of rage, then countered the attack with his own lightning. As the 2 combatants were locked in a force duel, Anakin could feel the strain and directed his bolts into the ceiling, and the roof began to crumble, then fall on their heads. Anakin slid under the Sith's desk to block the rubble, and as Palpatine tried to recover, he threw his lightsaber in an arc to slice the forehead of the Sith. As the exhausted Anakin slumped to the floor, the ground started to shake, unable to sustain the weight of all of the rubble, and the building fell silent. The next time Anakin awoke, he was in the Senate Med Center, and surrounding him were Obi-Wan, Shmi, Padme and several Jedi. The true extent of the destructive duel was one Anakin intended to keep from the Jedi, and once his injuries were largely healed, more of Palpatine's schemes were uncovered. As the Galactic Senate entered a period of reform, Anakin and Obi-Wan were offered chances to be a Jedi again, but neither were willing to do so unless the Order was subject to drastic changes. Settling instead for more peaceful options, Anakin wanted to ensure the power of the lightning remained in his hands to the end.